The resume came in at 4:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, one of 211 applications for a single senior consultant position, and I almost didn't open it myself. My assistant usually filters these. But something made me pull the folder marked Final Round, Logistics Consultant, approved by Regional HR, and scroll through the 6 names HR had already vetted. The 5th name stopped my hand on the mouse. Richard A. Johnson, 61, Millport, Ohio, relocated to San Jose, California. 28 years in freight logistics management. Recently separated from previous employer. I sat very still in my office on the 14th floor, glass wall behind me looking out over a city he'd never once visited to see what I'd built, and I thought about the last thing he ever said to me in person. "You'll never amount to anything, Sarah. Pack a bag." That was 15 years, 1 continent and 1 company ago. I didn't close the file. I read it 3 times. Then I did something I don't usually do. I picked up the phone and called my head of HR directly. "Don't cancel the interview," I told her. "Don't change anything. I want to sit in on this one myself." I didn't tell her why my name is Sarah Whitfield. I'm 34 years old, and I'm the founder and CEO of Halcyon Freight Systems, a logistics optimization company that today runs supply chain software for manufacturers across 14 countries. We closed our Series C at a $340 million valuation 18 months ago. None of that matters yet. What matters is Millport, Ohio, population 6,214, and a house on Cedar Ridge Road with a basketball hoop over the garage that was bolted up for my younger brother Mark and never for me. I want to be precise about this story because precision is the one thing I learned to weaponize long before I learned to forgive it out of myself. So let me start with facts, not feelings. My father, Richard Johnson, was a logistics manager for a regional freight company for 28 years. He was competent, respected at work from what I could tell. At home, he ran the household like a supply chain with one bottleneck: me. My mother, Diane, worked part-time at a dental office and mostly stayed quiet, which I understood much later was its own kind of survival strategy. My brother Mark is 2 years younger than me, and from the time I was maybe 7 years old, I understood without anyone explaining it that Mark was the point of the family and I was the overhead. I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because it's the operating fact you need to understand everything that follows. Here's a detail I still remember with total clarity. The summer I turned 16, I got my first job at a hardware store 2 towns over, cashiering on weekends for $6.75 an hour. I saved every check in a manila envelope taped under my mattress. Not because I didn't trust a bank, but because I didn't trust my house. By the time I graduated high school, I had $2,140 saved. My father knew about it. He'd found it once during one of his room inspections, which was really just him going through my things whenever he felt like it. No explanation required, because it was his house and I was, in his words, a guest until proven otherwise. That's a real thing he said to me. A guest until proven otherwise. I was 14. The favoritism wasn't subtle, and it wasn't occasional, it was structural. The way a badly designed supply chain has a permanent choke point that nobody fixes because fixing it would mean admitting the whole system was built wrong from the start. When Mark turned 16, my father bought him a used Honda Civic outright. Paid in cash, $4,200, no questions, no conditions. When I turned 16 and asked, not for a car, just for gas money to get to my hardware store job, I was told that I needed to learn the value of things and I could take the bus. Took the bus. 2 transfers, 55 minutes each way for 2 years. When college applications came around, there was a fund. I knew there was a fund because my mother mentioned it once, tired and not thinking, over dishes. "Your father's been putting money away for you kids since you were born, don't worry." I held on to that sentence for 2 years like it was a promise, because in my head it was the one piece of proof that maybe I wasn't just overhead. Maybe there was a line item for me after all. There wasn't. Or rather, there had been, and it had been quietly redirected. I found out my senior year, sitting at the kitchen table with acceptance letters from 3 schools spread out in front of me, one of them Ohio State with a partial scholarship that still left an $11,000 annual gap. I asked my father carefully about the fund my mother had mentioned. He didn't even look up from his newspaper. "That's Mark's fund," he said. For when he's ready. Mark was 14. He had 4 years before he'd need a dime of it. I had an $11,000 gap due in 9 months. I want you to sit with that for a second because I think a lot of people listening to this have their own version of that kitchen table moment. The moment you realize the promise was never actually about you. If that's you, I want you to know I see it, and I know exactly how quiet and how loud that kind of silence can be at the same time. I didn't scream. I didn't cry at the table, not in front of him. I'd learned by then that tears were just more evidence for his theory that I was too emotional to be taken seriously, a phrase he used often enough that I actually wrote it down once in the back of a notebook, like evidence I might need later. I went to my room, I did the math, and I applied for every private scholarship I could find that didn't require parental financial disclosure. Got exactly $3,000 one time from a regional Rotary Club essay competition. Covered a semester of books. What happened next is the part of the story that ends this chapter, so let me tell it exactly as it happened because the exact sequence matters. 2 weeks after graduation, I told my parents at dinner that I decided to defer enrollment for a year to save money and figure out a plan that didn't leave me $44,000 in debt for a degree my father had already made clear he didn't think I'd do anything with anyway. My father put his fork down. He didn't yell. That was never his style. His style was worse in a way because it was cold and it was final. If you're not going to school and you're not contributing to this household, he said, then you need to figure out where you're actually going to live. Because it's not going to be here doing nothing. I said I had a job. I said I was saving. I said I needed maybe 6 more months. You'll never amount to anything, Sarah, he said. Flat. Not even angry. Like he was reading a weather report. Pack a bag. That night I packed 1 duffel bag, my laptop, a second-hand Dell I'd bought off a classified site for $180, and the manila envelope, which by then held $1,970 after 2 years of chipping away at a car repair and a broken phone screen. I sat on the porch steps until the bus station opened at 5 a.m. My mother didn't come out. Mark's light was off. My father's truck was already gone. He'd left for an early shift, like it was any other Tuesday. I bought a one-way ticket to the only place I could afford that felt far enough away to actually mean something. London, using a student work visa program I'd read about that summer, on a $340 stipend and a plan that existed mostly in my head. I didn't know yet what I was going to build. I only knew what I was never going back to be. Pattern interrupt. Here's the thing nobody tells you about being thrown away by your own family. You don't actually break. You just go very, very quiet. And you start building something they can't see. London in October is grey in a way that gets into your bones, and I arrived with $340, a duffel bag, and an address for a hostel in Bethnal Green that I'd found on a forum 3 nights before, which was as far ahead as I'd planned. I want to be honest with you about this part of the story because I think revenge stories get told wrong when they skip the boring, brutal middle and jump straight to the money. The middle is where everything actually got built. The middle is the part that matters. For the first 4 months I worked 2 jobs. Nights I did data entry for a logistics brokerage in Canary Wharf. A temp contract, £9.50 an hour, inputting freight manifests and customs codes into a system that was, frankly, a disaster. Bills of lading logged by hand. Duplicate entries. Shipments that got flagged for customs delays because nobody had built a system to catch mismatched HS codes before they hit the port. I noticed this within my first 2 weeks. The way you notice a broken step on a staircase you walk every day. Mornings and weekends, I pulled shifts at a coffee shop near Liverpool Street, which is where I met Priya, the only person from that entire year who I'd still call a friend today. She used to let me sit in the back after close and use the shop's Wi-Fi on my dying Dell laptop, and that's where, somewhere around month 3, running on maybe 5 hours of sleep a night, I started building what would eventually become Halcyon. The idea wasn't complicated, at least not at first. I'd watched the brokerage lose money every single week to the same 3 problems. Mismatched customs codes, manual manifest entry errors, and zero visibility into where a shipment actually was once it left the warehouse. I wasn't a programmer by training. I taught myself Python from free online courses during my old bus commutes back in Millport, the same 55-minute rides that used to just be dead time. I built a rough tool, barely more than a script, that cross-referenced HS codes against a customs database and flagged mismatches before they got submitted. I showed it to my supervisor at the brokerage, half expecting to get told to stay in my lane. Instead, he used it. Quietly at first, just for his own desk. Then he told 2 other people. Within 6 weeks, 4 people on the floor were using a tool I'd built on a laptop I'd bought for $180. That's when I understood something that changed the entire trajectory of my life. I wasn't overhead. I had just never been given a system that let anyone see what I actually was. Rehook. Now, if you think this story is about a girl who left home and got lucky, I need you to reconsider everything I've told you so far. Because luck is not what put a resume on my desk 15 years later. Every single humiliating, underestimated moment in Millport was, without me even realizing it, training. My father taught me, by exclusion, by cold arithmetic, by making me prove myself for scraps, exactly how to build something airtight enough that nobody could ever take it from me quietly. He just didn't know he was teaching me that. He thought he was teaching me my place. I left the brokerage after 8 months, not angry, just clear-eyed. I'd taken my tool, cleaned up the code with help from a free coding boot camp I did on weekends, and pitched it, cold, to a small produce importer that was hemorrhaging money on customs delays. I remember the exact number because I've never forgotten a number that mattered. They offered me a $12,000 contract to build them a working version, paid in 3 installments, first one on signing. I signed that contract in a pret-a-manger, using their table because I didn't have an office, on a laptop with a cracked corner and a coffee stain Priya's manager never noticed. I remember calling her that night from a payphone. My own phone had died 2 days earlier and I hadn't had the money to fix it yet, just to say, I think I might actually have something here. That $12,000 contract became my second contract, a $34,000 deal with a mid-size freight forwarder 6 months later. Once word got around that the produce importer had cut their customs delay incidents by 60% in 1 quarter. By the end of that first year in London, I had incorporated Halcyon Freight Systems Ltd., registered at company's house with an address that was, technically, still Priya's flat, because I still didn't have my own. I want to be clear about something because I think it's important. I wasn't thinking about revenge during any of this. I wasn't building Halcyon to prove anything to Richard Johnson. I was building it because it was the only thing in my life at that point that responded honestly to effort. You put the work in, the system got better. You found the bug, you fixed it, the manifests cleared. There was no favoritism in code. There was no fund that quietly became someone else's. There was just the work, and what the work produced that, more than any dramatic confrontation, is what I actually want you to take from this part of the story. If you've ever been made to feel like overhead in your own family, like the cost center instead of the investment, I hope you find the version of this that's yours. Not because it leads to some big reveal, but because it's the only kind of foundation that never quietly gets redirected to someone else. By year 3, Halcyon had 9 employees, a proper office in Shoreditch, and a first institutional investor. A seed round of $1.2 million from a fund that specialized in supply chain tech, which at the time felt like more money than I could conceptually hold in my head. I hadn't spoken to my parents in that entire 3 years. Not one call. My mother had my email. I'd sent it once, the week I landed, more out of habit than hope, and she used it exactly twice. Once to tell me Mark had gotten engaged, and once 2 years later to tell me she had stage 3 ovarian cancer. I flew home for that. I'll tell you about it because it matters to everything that comes after, but not yet. That's the next chapter. Pattern interrupt. I need you to remember one detail from this chapter because it comes back later and it comes back hard. The customs code mismatch tool. Hold on to that. I flew back to Ohio when I was 26, 4 days after my mother's diagnosis. On a ticket I bought myself for $890 one-way because I didn't trust that a round trip would still feel true by the time I needed to use the return leg. I hadn't seen my father in 6.5 years. I hadn't seen Mark since his engagement photos, which my mother had emailed me with the subject line, "Your brother." Party popper, and no other context, no invitation, no acknowledgement that I might want to have been there. The house on Cedar Ridge Road looked smaller than I remembered, the way childhood houses always do, except this one felt smaller in a way that had nothing to do with my height. My mother was in the hospital by the time I landed, so it was my father who picked me up from the airport in Columbus, A 90-minute drive he made almost entirely in silence. Here is the full transcript of that car ride, more or less, because I remember it precisely. 20 minutes in, he asked what I did for work now. I told him I ran a logistics software company. He said, "Huh," and turned the radio up. 40 minutes in, he mentioned that Mark had just been promoted to assistant regional manager at the same freight company my father had worked at for 28 years. The same company, incidentally, whose customs bottlenecks had been the exact problem I'd built my first tool to solve. He said it with more warmth in 4 sentences than he'd shown me in the first 40 minutes combined. An hour in, he asked if I was seeing anyone, and when I said no, he said, "Well, you always did put work before everything else," in a tone that made it sound like a diagnosis rather than an observation. I want to walk you through 3 more moments from that visit, because I think this is the part of the story where people often want me to just say, "He was a bad father," and move on, and I don't think that's honest or useful. The truth is more specific than that. And specificity is what actually lets you understand a pattern instead of just feeling wounded by it. The first moment happened at the hospital the second night. My mother was lucid, tired but lucid, and Mark had brought his fiancée, Kelly, to visit. My father introduced Kelly to a nurse who came in to check vitals. "This is Mark's fiancée, Kelly, she's a physical therapist." Full context, full pride, the way you'd want a parent to introduce someone who mattered. 20 minutes later, that same nurse asked who I was. My father said, "That's Sarah. She's visiting from London." No job. No context. Visiting like I was passing through on holiday rather than someone who'd built a company that, by that point, employed 14 people. I remember standing there in the hallway, holding a vending machine coffee I didn't want, listening to my own introduction get reduced to a single word, visiting, and thinking about how precise language actually is, even when people don't mean it to be. He hadn't lied. I was technically visiting. But visiting is what you call a stranger's stopover. It isn't what you call your daughter. The second moment was at dinner 3 nights later. My father's version of hosting, which was ordering pizza and setting it on the counter in the box. He spent nearly the whole meal asking Mark detailed questions about his new role. Head count, territory, whether the regional director had said anything about a further promotion down the line. When there was a lull, I mentioned carefully that Halcyon had just closed a $1.2 million seed round. My father nodded, said, "That's good," and immediately turned back to Mark to ask if he'd looked at the 401k matching increase HR had mentioned that quarter. I didn't bring it up again. Not because I was hurt, or not only because I was hurt, but because I understood, watching him, that the reaction wasn't going to change no matter how the numbers grew. It wasn't a math problem. It was a decision he'd made a long time ago about which of his children was worth listening to. And no seed round was going to undo it. The third moment is the one that actually mattered most, though I didn't understand why until years later. On my last night before flying back, I asked my father directly. Not accusingly, just directly, the way I'd ask a vendor about a missed shipment, why the college fund had gone to Mark. I wasn't looking for an apology. I think, if I'm honest, I was looking for an explanation good enough that I could finally stop turning it over in my head at 2 a.m. in a foreign country. He looked at me for a long moment and then he said, "You didn't need it. You were always going to figure it out on your own. Mark needed the help. You didn't need it." That sentence sat in me for years, because on the surface it almost sounds like a compliment, a father's confidence in his daughter's competence. But sit with the mechanics of it the way I eventually did, the way you'd audit a broken process. The reward in my father's system wasn't given to the child who worked the hardest or needed it the most. It was withheld from the child who was strong enough to survive without it, and redirected to the child who wasn't. Permanently, structurally, without review, without an end date, a fund that never once got revisited even after Mark, at 28, still hadn't touched a cent of his own savings because he'd never had to. That's not scarcity. Scarcity I could have forgiven. What I understood, sitting in that kitchen at 26 with a $1.2 million seed round in my company's bank account and a duffel bag from a decade earlier still living somewhere in my memory, was that this had never really been about money. It was about who my father had decided, before I was even old enough to argue about it, deserved to be invested in. And who was simply expected to manage on her own. Pattern interrupt. I want to pause here and say something directly to you if any of this sounds familiar. Being the strong one in a family isn't always a compliment. Sometimes it's just the label people give the child they've decided they don't need to show up for. My mother passed 8 months later. I flew back for the funeral on another one-way ticket, because by then one-way had just become how I traveled. My father didn't ask me to speak. Mark did the eulogy. A good one, genuinely warm and funny in the right places, and I sat in the third pew and felt something complicated that wasn't quite jealousy and wasn't quite grief. Just the strange ache of watching your brother get to be soft about losing a parent while you're still doing the math on what you lost long before she died. Afterward, at the reception in the church basement, an aunt I barely remembered, my mother's cousin, I think, someone who'd flown in from Pittsburgh, asked me kindly what I ended up doing with my life. I told her, founder, CEO, a software company, 14 employees at the time, a seed round she wouldn't have context for, but I explained anyway. She looked genuinely stunned. She said, "Richard never mentioned any of that." I had no idea. He hadn't. Not once, in 8 years, had my father told a single relative what I'd built. Not out of secrecy or spite, I don't think. I think it simply hadn't occurred to him that it was worth mentioning. I wasn't a talking point in his life. I was a footnote he'd stopped reading. I flew back to London 2 days after the funeral. I didn't call again. Neither did he. That silence held for 6 more years. 6 years in which Halcyon grew from 14 employees to over 400, from a seed round to a Series C, from a scrappy customs matching script built on a cracked laptop to a platform running supply chain logistics for manufacturers across 14 countries. 6 years in which I moved from London to San Francisco to be closer to our largest investors, changed my professional surname back from my brief marriage to Whitfield, and built a life so far removed from Cedar Ridge Road that Millport, Ohio started to feel less like a place I was from and more like a place I'd read about once. 6 years of silence. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in my 14th floor office, a resume landed on my desk with a name on it I hadn't heard spoken aloud in 6 years, attached to a company that, until that moment, my father had no idea I owned. Emotional mirror. If you've ever gone quiet for years after someone made it clear exactly where you ranked in their eyes, I want you to know that silence isn't weakness. It's often the sound of someone finally done asking to be seen by people who already decided not to look. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't I want to take you back inside that office on the 14th floor at 4:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, because I don't think I did justice the first time to what actually happened in the 90 minutes that followed. I've replayed those 90 minutes more times than almost anything else in my adult life, and I still find new details every time I go back to it. The particular gray of the sky over the bay through my window, the fact that I hadn't eaten since a granola bar at 11 a.m., the sound of the building's HVAC cycling on right as I opened that 5th file, as if even the building knew something was about to shift. Let me set the scene properly first because I think context matters here. Halcyon's San Francisco headquarters occupies 3 floors of a building on 2nd Street. Floors 12 through 14, glass and exposed concrete, the kind of office that photographs well for the press pieces we occasionally get written about us but that I still, 6 years in, sometimes walk into and think, this is real, this is actually mine. My office is a corner on 14, and Denise, my assistant, sits just outside it, filtering roughly 90% of what would otherwise land on my desk. The folder she'd flagged that afternoon was labeled Final Round, Senior Logistics Consultant, San Jose Office, approved by Regional HR. It wasn't unusual for me to review final round candidates for senior roles. It's one of the few operational habits I've kept since the company was 9 people instead of 400, mostly because I think a CEO who's completely disconnected from who's actually walking through the door is a CEO who's lost the thread of what she built. I do this maybe once a quarter for maybe 8 to 10 roles total. Never every hire, just the ones that catch my eye or the ones for offices I feel less connected to day to day. San Jose was one of those. We'd opened that satellite office 14 months earlier to serve West Coast manufacturing clients, and I hadn't yet built the same instinct for its hiring pipeline that I had for San Francisco or London. 6 names. 6 PDFs, each with a headshot, a resume, a summary sheet from the recruiter, and a compliance checklist confirming references had been initiated. I opened them in order, the way I always do. left to right on the folder oldest application first, because I found that if I let myself skip around, I start forming opinions based on nothing but instinct. And instinct is exactly the thing that got my father's generation of hiring managers in trouble. The first four were unremarkable in the way most strong candidates are unremarkable: solid backgrounds, reasonable salary expectations. Nothing that made me pause longer than the standard 90 seconds I give each file. One had come from a competitor, one from a manufacturing client directly, two from general applications. Fine. Competent. Forgettable in the specific way that competence often is. The fifth file opened, and I saw a headshot before I saw the name, and something in my chest did something I can only describe as a structural shift, the kind you feel in a building during a very small earthquake before your brain even catches up to register what's happening. I remember my hand actually stopped on the mouse, mid-scroll, hovering. He'd aged the way people age when work has been hard on their body for 3 decades. Heavier through the face than I remembered, grayer at the temples in a way that had spread further than I expected, a deep line between his eyebrows that I now understood. Looking at it as an adult instead of a frightened was probably just what worry looks like after enough years of it. His shoulders, even in a headshot, looked lower than I remembered, not slumped exactly but settled. The posture of a man who'd stopped expecting to be surprised by life. But it was him. There was no version of that face that wasn't my father's face. I would have known it in a crowd of 10,000 strangers. Richard A. Johnson, age 61. Most recently, Regional Logistics Manager, Continental Freight Partners, San Jose, California, 2019-present separated. Prior, Millport Freight and Distribution, Millport, OH, 1994 to 2019, 25 years. I sat there and read his employment history like it was a stranger's, except it wasn't a stranger's. It was the man who'd told a 14-year-old she was a guest until proven otherwise. And here he was 20 years later, being summarized in 12-point font as a candidate, reduced to bullet points on a template, exactly the same template that would summarize anyone else. There was something almost unbearably leveling about it. The man who had once been the entire weather system of my childhood was, in this document, just another applicant. I made myself read the whole file properly, the way I'd read anyone's, because I think the version of me that had built Halcyon from a cracked laptop had learned, above almost everything else, to separate the reaction from the analysis. The reaction could come later. The analysis needed to come first. That discipline, reaction second, analysis first, is, I'll admit, one of the only genuinely useful things I ever absorbed from watching him run a household like an operation. He just never once turned it on himself the way I was about to turn it on him. Here's what the file told me, and I want to go through it methodically, the way I actually went through it that evening, because the details matter enormously to what happened next. Separation from Continental Freight Partners. The recruiter's note said, position eliminated, restructuring, which is corporate language for a layoff, and in my experience it's the kind of note that's usually true but incomplete. Companies restructure constantly. The question is always who gets protected in a restructuring and who doesn't, and a 61-year-old regional manager 2 years from a pension cliff is very often exactly the kind of person restructuring quietly targets, whether or not anyone ever says so out loud in the termination paperwork. I didn't know that for certain yet. I made a note, an actual note, pen on the legal pad I keep beside my keyboard, to find out. Relocation. He'd moved from Millport to San Jose 18 months earlier, which surprised me more than almost anything else in the file, because I couldn't immediately think of a reason my father, at 59, would uproot from the only town he'd ever lived in, a town he'd told me once, unprompted, that he intended to die in. I read further. The recruiter's notes mentioned, almost in passing, buried in a field most candidates leave blank, that the move had been to be closer to family. I didn't know what that meant yet. Mark, as far as I knew from the sparse second-hand updates that occasionally reached me through my aunt in Pittsburgh, was still in Ohio, still working at the same freight company, still living 20 minutes from Cedar Ridge Road. So who exactly was family in San Jose? Compensation history. His last role had paid $94,000 a year, a number that told its own quiet story. 28 years in an industry, a management title, and a salary that had clearly plateaued hard sometime in his 50s, the kind of plateau that happens to people who get boxed into a regional role and never get pushed up or pushed out until the company decides to do the pushing for them. For comparison, and I did this comparison almost involuntarily, sitting there, our own senior logistics consultants in comparable markets started at $118,000 base. He'd have been getting a real increase if he made it through. Financial hardship disclosure. This was the detail that actually stopped me cold, because it's not something every candidate includes. It's an optional field, usually only filled in by candidates applying for roles with relocation assistance or signing bonuses, where they disclose current financial circumstances to be considered for expedited compensation. My father had filled it in. He'd requested consideration for an accelerated first paycheck cycle, and if possible, a signing bonus paid on offer acceptance rather than after the standard 90-day period our policy usually specifies. I sat with that for a long moment, long enough that Denise knocked once, softly, to ask if I still needed her for the day, and I said no, go home, without really looking up. My father, who had once told me at 14 that I needed to learn the value of things while buying his son a car outright, in cash, no conditions, was at 61, requesting an accelerated paycheck because he needed the money faster than our standard payroll cycle would provide it. Pattern interrupt. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment because I think it would be dishonest to pretend it was pure vindication. It wasn't. It was something closer to vertigo, the specific disorienting feeling of watching an old, enormous fear turn out to be a tired, ordinary 61-year-old man. The man who'd spent my entire childhood as an immovable, all-powerful authority was, on paper, in front of me, just someone who needed his first paycheck faster than usual, the same way I once needed gas money he wouldn't give me. Didn't close the file. I sat there another full minute, the office going quiet around me as the floor emptied out, the city outside sliding into that particular blue-gray San Francisco evening light. Then I did something I want to describe carefully because I think it's the hinge the entire rest of this story turns on. I picked up the phone and called my head of HR, a woman named Renata who'd been with Halcyon since we were 40 people, someone I trusted completely, someone I'd hired myself back when I still personally interviewed every role above coordinator level. Renata, I said when she picked up on the second ring. The final round candidate for the San Jose senior consultant role, Richard Johnson. I need you to walk me through exactly where we are in the process. She pulled it up while we talked. I could hear her keyboard. Panel interview completed 2 weeks earlier. A standard 3-person panel, none of whom, obviously, had any idea who he was to me, because Halcyon's org chart doesn't broadcast that our CEO's maiden name was Johnson. I'd been Whitfield professionally for 8 years by then, ever since a brief marriage in my late 20s that hadn't lasted but whose surname I'd kept because, frankly, it was easier than explaining a name change twice. Reference checks initiated, 2 of 3 completed and positive. One former colleague describing him as reliable, thorough, doesn't cut corners, which landed somewhere strange in my chest, because I knew that description was true and I also knew exactly how selectively that thoroughness had once been applied at home. One final round remaining. A conversation with a senior leadership stakeholder, which for a role at this level was standard practice, and which, I confirmed with Renata, carefully, neutrally, hadn't yet been assigned to anyone specific. I want to sit in on this one myself, I told her. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that told me Renata was recalibrating, because I hadn't personally conducted a final round interview in over 2 years. We had a whole leadership layer built specifically so I wouldn't need to, precisely so that hiring stayed consistent and didn't hinge on my calendar. Everything okay? She asked, and I could hear the real question underneath it. Why this one specifically out of 211 applicants across 6 open roles this quarter? Everything's fine, I said. I just want this one. Don't change anything about the process. Don't flag it as unusual. I want it run exactly like every other final round. Same rubric, same scorecards, same everything. I didn't tell her why. I want to be honest that in the moment I wasn't entirely sure myself what why even meant yet. Whether I wanted to confront him, expose him, help him, humiliate him, or simply confirm with my own eyes that the man from Cedar Ridge Road and the name on this resume were the same person standing in the same body, 20 years and 2,400 miles away from where he'd told me to pack a bag. After I hung up with Renata, I did one more thing that evening. Alone in the office, everyone else gone, just the hum of the building and the reflection of my own desk lamp in the dark window glass. I opened a new browser tab and searched his name alongside Continental Freight Partners. Not because I doubted the layoff, but because 16 years of building a company had taught me one unbending rule, the same rule I apply to every vendor contract, every acquisition target, every investor term sheet that's ever crossed my desk. Never act on a single data point when more data is one search away. The second result was a class action wage dispute filing, 4 months old, naming Continental Freight Partners as defendant, alleging systematic misclassification of regional managers to avoid overtime pay obligations under California labor law. And my father's name was listed among the named plaintiffs. I read it twice. My father, a man who, in 28 years in Ohio, had never once in my presence questioned an employer, who'd taught me that, you don't rock the boat, you just do the job, who'd once told me that people who complained about their bosses were looking for excuses, was, at 61 in California, a named plaintiff in active litigation against the company that had just let him go. I closed the laptop screen halfway. Just sat there for a moment in the quiet of my office, 14 floors above a city he'd never visited to see any of it, and thought, with a clarity that surprised me, there is so much more here than a resume. This wasn't a coincidence landing on my desk. This was a man in genuine, specific, documentable financial and legal distress, applying for a job at a company he had no idea his daughter had built out of a cracked laptop and $340, 16 years after he'd told her she'd amount to nothing. Picked the phone back up. This time I called our general counsel. Pattern interrupt. Here's what I need you to understand before the next part of this story. I did not, at any point that night, plan to do anything that wasn't clean. Not out of restraint for his sake. Out of respect for the thing I'd actually built, which was too important to me, too hard one, to ever let get sloppy. Even for this. Even for him, my general counsel's name is Diane Okafor. No relation to my mother, though the coincidence of the first name always gave me a small, strange jolt whenever I dialed her extension, which I did at 5:14 p.m. that Tuesday, 42 minutes after I'd first opened that resume. Diane had been with Halcyon since our Series A, poached from a firm that specialized in employment law, and she had exactly the kind of mind I needed in that moment. Careful, unemotional, allergic to shortcuts, the sort of person who reads a contract twice even when she wrote it herself. I need to talk through a hypothetical, I told her. And I need you to tell me honestly if it's actually a hypothetical or if it's a compliance problem. She said, go ahead, in the tone she uses when she already suspects it isn't a hypothetical. Diane has never once, in 6 years, let me get away with pretending something wasn't real just because I dressed it up in conditional language. I laid it out for her exactly as I'd found it. A final round candidate for a senior role in San Jose who happened to be a first-degree relative of mine, whom no one else in the company knew was a relative, who had already cleared a panel interview and 2 reference checks on merit, with 1 final conversation remaining. I told her I wanted to conduct that final conversation myself. Diane didn't say anything for a moment, which is a habit of hers I've learned to respect. She thinks in silence, and out loud people mistake it for hesitation, but it's actually the opposite. When she spoke, she asked the exact right question. Does anyone on the panel or in HR know the relationship? No. Has he applied to this role knowing you're CEO? I don't think so. I go by Whitfield professionally. I don't think he even knows Halcyon is mine at all. I don't think he's thought about me in relation to my career in years, honestly. Okay, she said. Then here's your exposure and here's your clean path. And I want you to listen to both before you decide anything, because I know you, and I know you've already decided you're doing this. The exposure, she explained, was straightforward. If I conducted a biased or improperly influenced final interview, favoring him because he's my father, or conversely retaliating against him through the hiring process because of our personal history, and it later surfaced, through a disgruntled employee, a lawsuit, a due diligence process ahead of our next funding round, anything at all, it could constitute a conflict of interest violation under our own internal governance policy. Depending on how it played out, it could potentially expose the company to a discrimination or retaliation claim from him, or a favoritism claim from any of the 5 other final round candidates who didn't get the job if he did. Boards get very nervous about undisclosed family relationships in hiring chains, she added. Even when nothing improper happens. The appearance alone is a liability. But, she said, and I could hear the shift in her voice, the part where she moves from lawyer mode into something closer to genuine strategy. There's a version of this that's completely clean, and it's not complicated. You disclose the relationship internally, to me and to Renata, in writing right now before that final interview happens, not after. You don't remove yourself from the process entirely because, frankly, you're allowed to sit in on final interviews. You do it periodically for senior roles, there's precedent going back years. But you formally recuse yourself from the hiring decision itself. The panel's existing evaluation stands as is. Any final call is made by the hiring manager and Renata, not you, and it's documented as such, time-stamped, signed. You can observe. You cannot decide. I remember exactly where I was standing when she said this. By the window, looking down at the street, at a delivery truck idling badly enough that I could hear the vibration through double-paned glass 14 stories up. That works for me, I said. Document it. I want it in writing tonight, both directions, my disclosure and your guidance memo. Timestamp everything. One more thing, Diane said, and this is the part that changed the shape of everything that followed. If you're asking me this carefully at 5 p.m. with this much detail, already thinking about documentation and timestamps before you've even decided what you want out of the room, I don't think you just want to sit in on an interview, Sarah. I think you're trying to figure out what you're actually looking at. So let me ask you directly. What do you already know about him that isn't in that resume? I told her about the wage dispute filing. I told her about the accelerated paycheck request. I told her the relocation notes mentioned closer to family, and that as far as I knew, our family wasn't in San Jose. Diane was quiet again longer this time, and then she said something I've thought about often since. You're not asking me how to interview him. You're asking me whether it's safe to know more about him. Those are different questions, and only one of them is actually my job to answer. The first one I can help you with all night. The second one, that's yours. She was right, and I'll be honest with you about what I did next because I think pretending I acted purely out of clean legal caution would be dishonest. I was curious in a way that had nothing to do with governance policy. I wanted to understand the full shape of the man who was, at that exact moment, somewhere in San Jose, probably printing out directions to an office building he didn't know his daughter owned. I want to walk you through what I found over the following 4 evenings, because this is the actual turning point of the story. Not the interview itself, which comes later, but this quiet, methodical stretch where I sat at my kitchen island each night with a legal pad and slowly assembled a picture of my father's life that he had never once offered me himself, in 34 years voluntarily, the wage dispute in full. I had Diane pull the complete public court filing the next morning. Nothing improper here. It's a matter of public record in a class action, listed openly on the county superior court docket. Continental Freight Partners was accused of misclassifying regional managers like my father as exempt employees to avoid paying overtime, despite requiring them to perform substantial non-exempt logistics coordination work, the exact kind of manual manifest tracking and dispatch coordination, incidentally, that Halcyon's own software platform exists specifically to automate. There was something almost unbearably ironic in that detail, and I sat with it a long time. The tool I'd built out of rage and necessity in a coffee shop in London to fix the exact inefficiency that had cost my father, half a world away, tens of thousands of dollars in unpaid overtime he never even knew he was owed. The suit alleged that affected employees, over an average tenure of 6 years, were owed back overtime pay estimated between $40,000 and $95,000 per plaintiff, depending on hours logged. My father had been named a plaintiff 4 months earlier, roughly 6 weeks after his layoff. The case was still in early discovery. No settlement yet, no trial date set. The relocation. This took a little more digging, and honestly, the answer came from somewhere I hadn't expected. My aunt in Pittsburgh, whom I called directly on a real phone call, for the first time in 3 years. I framed it carefully, casually, as catching up. She was delighted to hear from me, which stung a little. The easy warmth of someone who'd never once made me feel like overhead. 2 questions in, she told me, without my even really having to ask directly. My father had moved to San Jose because Mark's marriage to Kelly had ended 18 months earlier, badly, and Mark, struggling, drinking more than he should according to my aunt's careful phrasing, behind on child support for his and Kelly's 2-year-old daughter, had moved to San Jose himself first, chasing a logistics coordinator job that hadn't panned out the way he'd hoped. My father had followed him out 6 months later. Richard's been trying to help him get back on his feet, my aunt said. It's been hard on him. He doesn't really talk about it, but I don't think it's going well for either of them. I sat with that information for a long time after I hung up. The favored son, the one the college fund had been quietly redirected to, the one who'd gotten the Honda Civic in cash and the warm hallway introductions and the dinner table interest, was 20 years later the reason my father had uprooted his entire life at 59, moved 3 states away, and was now sitting in a final round interview requesting an accelerated paycheck because he was, in some capacity I didn't yet fully understand, propping up a struggling adult son. The financial picture assembled. Between the salary plateau, the layoff, the relocation costs, the wage dispute still unresolved, and whatever he was quietly funneling toward Mark, I didn't need a forensic accountant to see the shape of it. My father was not comfortable. He was not, as I'd half expected walking into this process, a man secure enough in his pension and his paid-off house to be applying to Halcyon out of simple post-retirement restlessness. He needed this job. He needed it the way I had once needed gas money, except the stakes at 61 were considerably higher, and there was no manila envelope taped under a mattress waiting to bail him out. Emotional mirror. If you've ever done this, quietly research someone who hurt you, not to attack them but just to finally understand them, you know this particular uncomfortable feeling. It's not triumph. It's something closer to grief for a version of the story you'd told yourself for 20 years. A story that turns out to be more complicated than the villain you needed him to be. I want to be honest about where I landed that 4th night. Legal pad full. Kitchen gone dark around me except for the one light over the island. I wasn't angry anymore. Not in the sharp way I'd walked in with on Tuesday afternoon. I was something more useful than angry. I was clear. I understood finally exactly what I was holding. Not just a resume, not just an old grudge, but a complete, documented, verifiable picture of a man in genuine distress, walking unknowingly into a room with the one person on earth who had both every reason to let him fail and every actual tool required to decide, cleanly, on her own terms, whether he would close the legal pad. I picked up my phone one more time that night and texted Diane a single line. I know what I'm going to do. I need the recusal memo finalized by Thursday. The interview's Friday at 10 Friday morning. I was in the San Jose office by 8:30, an hour and a half before the interview, which was unusual enough that the office manager, a sharp young guy named Theo who ran that satellite location day to day, actually did a double take when I walked in. I told him I was there for a board prep call and needed a quiet conference room for the morning. He believed me, or at least didn't question it, and set me up in conference room B, glass-walled, overlooking the parking lot, with a view of exactly the kind of mid-sized sedan I imagined my father driving now. I want to describe the physical sensation of that morning honestly because I think it's easy, telling a story after the fact, to sound more composed than you actually were living through it. My hands were not steady when I poured my coffee. I checked my phone 4 times in 15 minutes for no reason. I reread the recusal memo Diane had finalized the day before, not because I'd forgotten what it said, but because rereading it was the only thing that made my pulse slow down. Clean language, time-stamped, my signature and Renata's signature and Diane's signature. A document that existed specifically so that whatever happened in that room in the next 2 hours would be defensible from every possible angle. I had done this the right way. I kept reminding myself of that. The way you'd check a locked door twice before leaving on a long trip. At 9:52, Renata knocked and stepped in, closing the door behind her. She'd flown down that morning specifically to co-run this one, at my request, and I could see in her face that she still didn't fully understand why, but she trusted me enough not to push. He's downstairs, she said. Checked in 8 minutes early. Theo's got him in the lobby. Bring him up at 10 exactly, I said. Not before. She looked at me for a second longer than necessary. Sarah, whatever this is, you're going to be fine in there. I didn't answer that because I genuinely didn't know if it was true. At exactly 10 o'clock the door opened, and my father walked into conference room wearing a gray suit that didn't quite fit him anymore. A little loose through the shoulders, The kind of suit a man buys once in his 40s and keeps wearing because buying a new one feels like admitting something. He was holding a manila folder with his printed resume and a legal pad, and he was looking at Renata, extending his hand to her first, saying, "Richard Johnson, thank you for having me," in a voice that hit me harder than I expected. Older, a little rougher, but unmistakably the voice that used to say pack a bag across a kitchen table. Then he turned to shake my hand, and I watched it happen in real time. The polite half-smile, the automatic professional courtesy of a man who's done 100 interviews in his life, and then the freeze. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't gasp, didn't drop his folder, nothing that would work in a movie. His hand just stopped mid-shake for maybe a full second. His eyes doing a rapid involuntary scan of my face the way you do when your brain is trying to overrule what it's seeing. Then, very quietly, in a voice that had lost all of its interview polish, "Sarah." "Hi, Dad," I said. I kept my voice level, professional, the same tone I'd have used with any candidate. "Please sit down." He sat down slowly, the way you sit when your legs aren't entirely sure they'll hold you. He looked at Renata, then back at me, clearly trying to reconstruct in real time how his estranged daughter was sitting on the interview panel for a logistics job in San Jose. "I don't," he started and stopped. I applied to Halcyon. "I didn't know." "You didn't know I run it," I said. "I know. That's all right. Let's start with a few standard questions, the same as we'd ask anyone, and then we can talk properly. Is that okay with you?" Rehook. I want to pause the scene here for a second because I think this is the moment that reframes everything you thought you knew about where the story was headed. If you assumed this chapter was going to be me finally getting to unload 16 years of grievance across a conference table, I need you to recalibrate. That version of the story would have felt good for about 4 minutes and cost me everything I'd actually built. What I chose instead took longer, and it's the part of this story I'm proudest of. I ran the interview by the book. I asked him about his experience with freight consolidation strategy, and he answered well. Genuinely well, more fluent and sharp than I expected, 28 years of real expertise showing through even with his hands slightly unsteady around his coffee cup. I asked him how he'd approach a client relationship where a manufacturing partner was consistently missing dispatch windows, and he gave a thoughtful, specific answer involving root cause analysis and vendor scorecards that Renata actually nodded along to, professionally impressed, with no idea what she was witnessing underneath the surface of it. Then I asked him a question that wasn't on the standard rubric. "Mr. Johnson, I noticed in your application that you requested consideration for an accelerated first paycheck. Can you help me understand the circumstances behind that request?" His face changed. Not anger. Something closer to exposure, the particular vulnerability of a proud man being asked, directly and calmly, to explain that he was in trouble. He glanced at Renata, then back at me, and I watched him decide in real time whether to lie to his daughter in a professional setting or tell a version of the truth to his daughter's employee. "I've had some unexpected expenses," he said carefully. "Family-related. I'd rather not go into detail, but I can assure you it wouldn't affect my performance." "I understand," I said, and I meant it more than he could have known. "I'm also aware, and I want to be transparent that this is public record, not something disclosed by you, that you're a named plaintiff in an active wage dispute with your former employer. I want you to know that has no bearing whatsoever on this process. It's not our company's business, and it's not going to factor into any evaluation here." He stared at me. I could see him doing the math. How much did I actually know, and how had I found it, and what did it mean that his daughter, sitting across a conference table from him for the first time in 6 years, had clearly gone looking? "You looked into me," he said quietly. "I did," I said. "The same way I'd look into anyone whose resume stopped me. Yours stopped me for a reason you can probably guess." Pattern interrupt. I need you to notice something here because it's easy to miss in the tension of the scene. I never once raised my voice in that room. Everything I said I could have said in front of our board, our compliance officer, a courtroom. That was never an accident. That was the entire design. Renata, to her enormous credit, stayed professionally quiet through this exchange, though I could see her recalibrating everything she thought she understood about the morning. I moved the interview back onto solid ground for another 10 minutes. Technical questions, scenario questions, the standard closing about compensation expectations, where he named a figure lower than what the role actually paid, which told me something too, about a man who'd been knocked down enough times that he'd started asking for less than he was worth. Near the end, I asked Renata for a moment alone with the candidate, and she stepped out, closing the door softly. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then my father set his folder down on the table and said, in a voice stripped of every bit of interview composure, "I don't understand what's happening right now." "I'm conducting a job interview," I said. "The same one I'd run for anyone. Sarah." He said my name the way he used to say it when I was in trouble as a teenager, except now there was something underneath it I'd genuinely never heard from him before, something closer to fear. "Are you doing this to humiliate me?" I looked at him for a long moment, really looked, the way I hadn't let myself look at him in 16 years, past the tired eyes and the ill-fitting suit and the manila folder, at the actual man who had once told a 14-year-old she was a guest in her own home. And I felt something settle in me that I want to describe honestly, because it wasn't triumph, and it wasn't forgiveness either. It was clarity. "No," I said. "I'm not doing this to humiliate you." "Could have. I want you to understand that. I could have ended this the moment I saw your name, and no one would have ever known why, and you'd have just gotten a form rejection email like the other 205 people who applied. I didn't do that. I sat with everything I found out about you for 4 days, and I decided I wanted to look you in the eye and let you explain yourself to me as a professional, on equal footing, in a room where I hold every advantage and chose not to use most of them." He didn't say anything. His jaw worked once, the way it used to when he was deciding whether to argue with me or shut a conversation down entirely. "I'm not going to make the hiring decision," I continued. "I've recused myself formally in writing because that's the right way to do this. Renata and the panel will decide based on your qualifications, exactly like they would for anyone else. I have no idea what they'll decide. I genuinely don't." "Then why are you here?" he asked. "Why sit in the room at all?" I closed his folder gently and slid it back toward him across the table. "Because I wanted you to know I was here," I said. "I wanted you to know exactly who built the thing you needed. Not to punish you with it. Just so you'd finally know." I stood up, straightened my jacket, and walked to the door. I stopped with my hand on the handle. "I'll be in touch," I said, the exact phrase HR uses with every candidate, deliberately, evenly. "Take care of yourself, Dad." I left him sitting alone in conference room B, and I want you to sit with that image for a second, the way I've sat with it 100 times since. My father, 61 years old, alone at a glass table with a resume in front of him, having no idea whether he'd just been hired, exposed, forgiven, or all three at once. I flew back to San Francisco that same afternoon, and I want to be honest about the 4 days that followed, because I think they matter more than the interview itself. I didn't call Renata. I didn't check the applicant tracking system. I didn't do anything to influence a decision I had, on paper and in practice, formally removed myself from. That discipline cost me something. I won't pretend it didn't. There were at least 2 nights that week I sat with my laptop open to the login screen for our HR platform, cursor hovering, before I closed it without looking. On the 5th day, Renata called me. "The panel wants to extend an offer," she said. "Unanimous." He was genuinely the strongest candidate. The technical scores were the highest of the 6. References came back excellent, and honestly, Sarah, if I hadn't known who he was to you, I'd have pushed for him regardless. He paused. "I still want to check with you before we send it. Given everything." I thought about it for a long moment, and here's what I decided, and here's the reasoning, because I think the reasoning matters as much as the "Send it," I said. "But route it through standard channels. New hire paperwork, onboarding, everything, exactly like any other consultant. He reports to the San Jose team lead, not to me, not to anyone who answers to me directly. I want zero contact between his role and my org chart. And Renata. Document in the file, formally, that I disclosed the relationship and recused myself before the final round. I want that on record permanently. Not because I think anyone will ever question it, but because I never want there to be a version of this story where it looks like I did anything I wouldn't do for a stranger." Pattern interrupt. "I want to say something directly to you here because I think this is the part people often get wrong about power. Real power isn't the moment you get to decide someone's fate. It's the moment you have every tool to decide it and choose, instead, to let the process work the way it's supposed to work. And only step in to make sure it's fair, not to make sure it favors you. The offer went out that Friday. $118,000 base, standard benefits, a signing bonus paid on the standard 90-day schedule. Because I never once instructed anyone to accelerate it, that decision belonged to the finance team, and they made it on the merits of the role, not the man. He accepted 3 days later. I know this only because it appeared, eventually, in a routine headcount report that crossed my desk the way every hire in the company eventually does. One line among 200 new names that quarter. I didn't feel triumphant reading it. I felt something quieter. Something closer to a door closing gently instead of slamming. But there was one more piece of this I hadn't resolved, and it had been sitting in me for 16 years, long before any resume landed on my desk. The college fund. The $11,000 gap. The sentence that had followed me across an ocean and back. That's Mark's fund, for when he's ready. I called my estate attorney the following week. Not Diane, this was personal, not corporate. A woman named Priscilla Vance who'd helped me set up my own family trust 2 years earlier, after Halcyon Series B, when I finally had enough assets that dying without a plan felt genuinely reckless. I told her what I wanted to do, and she walked me through the mechanics of it the way she walks me through everything. Carefully, with every angle covered. Here's what we structured. I didn't confront my father about the old fund. There was no version of that conversation that would have produced anything but more of the same defensive arithmetic I'd heard at 26. Instead, I had Priscilla draft a structured gift agreement, a formal instrument, fully documented, establishing a $50,000 educational trust in my own name. Not my father's, not tied to any apology or acknowledgement from him. Earmarked specifically for Mark's 2-year-old daughter, my niece, whom I had never met, to be held until her 18th birthday, administered independently. Released only for accredited educational expenses. I want to explain why I did it this way because I think it's the part of this story that actually closes the loop. I wasn't trying to finish my father's ledger for him, and I wasn't trying to erase what happened to me by generously funding the next generation like some kind of absolution performance. I did it because somewhere in those 4 nights of research, I'd learned that Mark's daughter existed, that Mark was struggling, that the cycle of scarcity and favoritism and quiet desperation in my family hadn't actually stopped with me. It had just moved down a generation, the way these things do when nobody names them out loud. I had the means to break that specific link in the chain. Not out of forgiveness for the people who'd hurt me. Out of respect for a 2-year-old who hadn't done anything to deserve inheriting the same story. I sent one letter. Not to my father, not to Mark, but to my aunt in Pittsburgh, the only person in my family who had ever, in 16 years, asked me a genuine question about my life. I asked her to pass along gently that a trust had been established for my niece, administered independently. No strings, no expectation of contact. I didn't sign it with any explanation. I didn't need her to understand why. I needed it done cleanly the way I do everything now. Emotional mirror. If you've ever found yourself wanting to fix the pattern instead of just escaping it, wanting the next generation to have something you didn't, even from people who never gave you a reason to be generous, I understand that impulse better than almost anything else in this story. It's not weakness. It's just what happens when you've finally built enough safety that you can afford to be the kind of person your family never let you be. My father worked at Halcyon's San Jose office for the following year. I never saw him again. I heard secondhand through a comment in Renata's quarterly review notes that he was performing well liked by his team, thorough, reliable. The exact words that colleague had once used in his reference check, the exact words that used to sting when I heard them applied so easily to a version of him I'd never gotten. I let that sting pass through me and out the other side, the way you let go of a held breath. He never called to thank me. He never called to acknowledge what he now understood. That the company that had, in the space of one financial quarter, quietly stabilized his life, was the daughter he'd once told to pack a bag. I used to think I needed that call. Sitting here now, I can tell you honestly that I don't anymore. People ask me sometimes. Investors mostly, in the kind of profile interviews that inevitably circle back to, what drives you? What it felt like sitting across that conference table from the man who told me I'd never amount to anything, watching him not recognize at first that the company he needed was the company I'd built out of nothing. I don't tell them the real answer, because it doesn't fit neatly into a founder profile. The real answer is that it didn't feel like winning. It felt like finally being able to put something down that I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it had weight. I think there's a version of this story that ends with me firing him on the spot, or rejecting him cruelly, or making sure he found out exactly how small I could make him feel, the way he'd once made me feel small at a kitchen table over an $11,000 gap. I understand the appeal of that ending. I considered it more than once, in the 4 days between finding his resume and walking into that room. But that ending would have made me someone I spent 16 years and one continent building myself away from. The real leverage was never the money, or the wage dispute, or the compensation gap. The real leverage was that I got to choose who I became in that room, and for the first time in my life that choice was entirely mine. I don't need my father to apologize anymore. I don't need him to say he was wrong about the fund, or the car, or the hallway introduction, or any of it. I got something better than an apology. I got proof, documented and clean and entirely on my own terms, that I was never the guest in that house. I was just the only one who ever had to prove she belonged there. If you've ever been told by someone whose approval you needed most, that you'd never amount to anything, I hope you remember that they were describing the limits of what they were willing to invest in you. They were never describing you.